My name's Craig Ellis. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist with High Match. We've also got Sarah here, who is our CRO, our Chief Revenue Officer. And the topic for today is navigating assessments and trying to choose the right fit for your organization. So this is the fifth installment in our semi-monthly webinar series. So very excited to have you. We're going to cover a lot of information around how to navigate and sort through all of the different assessment options and vendors that are out there. So really excited to have the chance to talk with you about it today. If you wouldn't mind hanging around at the end, we're going to share some links that you can use to schedule time to talk with one of our IO psychologists or with our sales team if you're interested, to learn a bit more about High Match and our approach and products and all of that fun stuff. So thanks again. Really excited to have you all. And we'll dive right in.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys for joining. I think at the top of a lot of these conversations that we're having with our HR teams, right, or our TA teams, is that at the end of the day, you're facing a ton of challenges, right? And we've highlighted a couple here, but I'm sure even this is really just scratching the surface, right? So when you think about, approaching hiring, I guess we're in September, right? So when you think about approaching hiring for next year, how do we get better throughput through our hiring funnel, right? Where we have people continuing to engage. What about the no-show rate once we start those individuals? Maybe that's not great for some of our individuals or for some of our clients. We've got people that are really focused on early tenure turnover, right? Those that are looking at the performance once you reach productivity, right? It's not where we'd like it, but I think there's a ton that's going on in terms of the employees that we have, and HR is typically at the helm of trying to figure out, right? How do we get a really great hiring process? And then how do we get really quality candidates that can do the job well? And then hopefully, retain, right? Who can stick with our company and continue to grow with us. So I think typically off the back of that, we see a lot of HR coming to us and of course, other individuals looking for assessments. We see that like 82% of companies are now using them in their hiring process. And when done right, when done the correct way for your organization, they certainly can make a difference in terms of your efficiency, right? The amount of money that you're spending to get those candidates hired, just the time to hire in general, right? There's a ton of benefits if you can start to automate some of the insights that you need during the hiring process so that you can feel better about the conversations you're having, and more confident in the hires that you're making. So we know assessments can definitely help. But we also know that when you start going to Google and saying that I'm looking for a pre-hire assessment or a sales assessment, it's an extremely crowded marketplace, right? We have actually just scratched the surface here in terms of how many are out there. I know there's hundreds, and it can be a little bit overwhelming, right? When you first kind of dip your toe in the water to start understanding what sort of assessment do I want to look for and what's going to help me. We also know that as a part of that conversation, right, you've got a lot of factors that are going into the decision that you're making. Budget is of course at the top of those, right? And whether it's carving out a piece of the budget and having to go in and ask for it, or whether it's a budget that's been handed to you, right? That can be a constraint for sure. Certainly timeline, right? Are you needing this assessment to really get started in the next 4 weeks because you've got a hiring class coming up quickly? Or is this something that would be much better folded in, at the beginning of the year, right? So timeline can certainly impact that. There's also the needs, right? Like what insights do you need to gather during the hiring process? There are a ton of different hard skills, soft skills, aptitudes, right? There's a ton of options out there. So it's really about understanding what would be helpful for you to understand, throughout the hiring process. And then lastly, we very politely called it resistance, right? Where we know that a part of the process is going out and finding a good kind of choice of vendors, right? Like who you want to start talking to. But then typically when you've narrowed that down, you've got to turn around and sell that vendor internally, right? We know there's additional decision makers and stakeholders who want to be a part of the decision and feel confident in what you're selecting as a team. And sometimes that can be a fun process and kind of fun hoops to jump through. So There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of how you're making that decision. And so how you go about it, it can be a little bit tricky, or it can be a little bit overwhelming. So what we want to talk through next is when you've acknowledged, right, that assessments is probably the answer, or it might be a good option to help tackle some of those challenges that we looked at the very beginning. How do you go about deciding which one is going to be the best fit for your organization and your needs? So I'm going to let Craig talk about what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks. I think the reality is that it's a lot to consider. Like Sarah said, if you pop into Google and you click leadership assessment or nursing assessment or Excel test, right? You're inundated with hundreds and hundreds of options. And how do you go about filtering through those options and finding the right vendor and the right tool to support your needs and the problem that you're trying to solve? And so, today we want to walk through a framework for how to narrow down your list and how to zero in on the right assessment and the right vendor for your needs. That framework includes, we like a multi-step process. So, and we've always heard that odd numbers tend to be more easily received. So we've got a 5-step process for you here to help you narrow down in your search. It's going to start with defining your problem and understanding the depth and significance of that problem through cost or potentially other business metrics. We're going to talk about how to identify the right approach, whether you need something that's off the shelf versus something that's highly custom or something that's somewhere in the middle. Like Sarah mentioned, you're operating under constraints, and those constraints create realities, and those realities inform, which assessment or which vendor is likely to be best for you. Once we've identified a vendor or some vendors, which assessments do we need to utilize to help to solve our problem, right? The specific problem often informs the type of assessment or assessments that you need to implement and utilize to solve it. And so we're going to talk through some of that. We also want to make sure that we're tracking progress, right? So if we have a problem at time A, right, we've got turnover, or we've got poor customer service, or some of those other challenges that Sarah referenced on that opening slide. How do we measure the impact of an assessment post-implementation, right? The goal is to solve a problem. And so what are the plans and tools that we need to put in place to measure whether that problem is actually being addressed with an assessment solution? And then finally, how do you interview vendors? Like, once you've really done a good job of narrowing down what you're looking for and you've identified, your final list, what are the things you should be looking for to make your decision? What are the questions you should be asking of your vendors? What are the key points that you want them to deliver on to help you zero in on the one that's right for you? So this is the framework that we're going to step through, and let's dive in. So, I think the reality of trying to land on an assessment and an assessment vendor is that 90% of that work can be done by doing a really good job defining your problem, right? So maybe you're here because you're looking for assessments, or that at some point in the future, you're going to look for assessments, or somebody on your internal leadership team has said, hey, we should start to think about assessments, because I've seen some research that assessment results can be used to predict job performance, right? And so, you're really getting started on, let's look at assessments. In order to start to look at the right kinds of assessments, you need to define what challenge it is that you're trying to solve, right? Because the kind of assessment methodology that is, well built to solve a turnover problem is very different from the kind of assessment methodology that's built to solve a training success problem versus a leadership success versus, our sales folks are getting in and they're really successful early on. And then at some point, 5 months, 6 months down the road, their success tapers off and we can't understand what's going on or why that's happening. So if you can do a really good job of defining what your problem is and the specific KPIs that you're trying to impact through the use of assessments, that goes a really long way to narrowing out, screening out a lot of the assessments or a lot of the potential vendors that you might need to consider in your search. And so whenever you set out on trying to identify an assessment provider or a specific tool, you should always use as your first step, what's the challenge? What's the problem that we have as a business, or the problem that we have with a given role that we're trying to solve through the implementation of assessments? That's one of the first questions that our sales team asks when they get on a call with someone who's landed on their calendar to talk about assessments is, hey, what's the challenge that you're having that's causing you to look for assessments? And inevitably, the folks who have done a really good job researching that internally and have a really nice understanding of what they're trying to accomplish allows them to get much more specific, much more quickly about how that problem can be solved. And so would always recommend taking time to define your KPAs, think about the costs of the challenge that you have, and really defining out the problem that you're trying to solve through the implementation of assessments. It'll go a really long way to helping expedite and narrow your search. Second is, right, once we've defined the kind of problem that we're trying to solve through the use of assessments, what type of assessment provider is going to be best suited to solve that problem? And we've kind of put these on a spectrum, and there are probably subcategories within some of these, broad buckets that we've drawn. But generally speaking, the assessment world goes from off the shelf. So tests that are pre-built, pre-validated, kind of one size fits all the way to completely custom, right? Which is, you've got a problem. We are going to, from scratch, build a suite of assessments or an assessment to solve that problem. Now, the challenges with some of the off-the-shelf assessments are, they are often validated assessments, but they're not locally validated for your employee population. And so the assumption has to be that the validation process that these vendors went through to build the tests in the first place makes them useful for this specific challenge and this specific role at your specific organization. And oftentimes that's not the case, right? Oftentimes a sales assessment might have been validated for a territory-based sales, whereas your sales folks are, taking leads and they're landing on their calendar. Those differences in job specifics often create differences in the assessment appropriateness, right? And so oftentimes there are some shortcomings of off-the-shelf assessments that might make them not necessarily appropriate for your needs. On the other side, most organizations are faced with limitations, some of the constraints that Sarah referenced earlier, that make it unreasonable for them to build assessments from scratch, right? There's a long timeline. There's a lot of learning and analysis and evaluation that has to happen before the assessment construction can even begin. They tend to be expensive to build them, completely custom from scratch. And oftentimes the folks who are building the assessments are delivering an assessment, and then you've got to go and find a technology platform to host it on that assessment, right? And so, there's this middle category, and this is where we sort of rest, which is, personalized modular-based assessments, right? And so the personalized vendors can work with you to define what you need, the assessment components that are going to be best suited to solve your problem, and then like Legos, build an assessment tower based on some of those modules, and then validate that assessment package to be used in your organization, right? And so oftentimes those constraints that you have, whether it's timing or budget, along with the challenge that you have and the challenge that you're trying to solve with a given role or given aspect of your organization, can help you zero in on, do we want an off-the-shelf versus custom versus personalized solution? As an IO psychologist, I could spend a year on this slide alone. There's a lot to unpack here, and so I'll try to be relatively brief. In the world of assessments, there are endless things that we can assess, right? Generally speaking, assessments and assessment vendors fall into three broad categories or buckets. right? If you think in HR terms, your KSAOs. The K and S, knowledge and skills, tend to be hard skill or knowledge retention based assessments that give you insight and data on whether someone can use Microsoft Excel, for instance, or whether they know the OSHA standards for construction safety, for instance, right? And so they're not personal qualities as much as they are reflective of an individual's specific knowledge or skills or history. In some cases, organizations seek out behavioral assessments, right? And so, our paralegals, right? One of the challenges that we hear sometimes, our paralegals are consistently missing important details in contracts, or they're missing important requests in emails. And so we're lacking detail orientation in this employee population. Detail orientation is heavily rooted in someone's personality or their behavioral tendencies. How careful do they tend to be? How precise do they tend to be when they're reviewing information for accuracy? And in some cases, right, if we deal with that knowledge, skills, abilities, oftentimes when people talk about abilities, they're talking about cognitive components, right? And so we hire mechanics, and our mechanics get in and they're making errors with the systems that they're working on, or they don't know how to use a specific tool, right? So maybe their mechanical reasoning is not up to par. And so the really interesting bit is where these categories start to overlap with one another. And so you see behavioral and skills-based components can overlap to create a situational judgment assessment. And cognitive and skills-based components can overlap to create a job simulation. And all three of these may overlap to create a leadership assessment. And so as you're working through and narrowing your list of vendors and assessment options, it can be useful to think about what are the things that we need to learn about candidates in order to solve this problem. And those things that you need to learn can help you narrow in on the specific assessments or the vendors who offer those assessments as you're trying to zero in on your assessment strategy. And then one of the most challenging pieces that often doesn't bubble up to the surface until close to implementation time with an assessment is, well, where is this going to fit into our process? And how are candidates going to access the assessment in the first place, right? And so when you think about your hiring process, it might include, the requisition being created in your ATS, and then candidates being able to apply, and then recruiters screening those applications and scheduling screening interviews, and those screening interviews being parlayed into interviews with hiring managers, and that interview with a hiring manager leading into a panel interview that leads into a job offer. Okay, that's your process. Now we've got to drop an assessment or potentially assessment modules into that process, right? And so what's the right way to do that? What's the best way to do that? Well, we know that our candidates prefer to take assessments on a mobile device. A lot of our candidates aren't going to have a desktop computer to sit down and take an assessment at. And so there are often procedural, process-oriented components to selecting the right vendor. Right? Are your assessments, compliant for individuals with certain disabilities? Can the candidates take assessments on a phone? Can your assessment platform host video? We've got an introductory video that we want to include at the beginning of our assessments. And that's really important for our branding and the way that we like to communicate with our candidates. And so all of these different elements need to be components of how you make your vendor and your assessment selection. Ultimately, the better fit the assessment is for your problem, your needs, and your process, the more likely that assessment is to be effective on a long-term, ongoing basis for solving that problem. And so as you begin your search for an assessment partner, the more that you can detail your challenges, your constraints, your process, and what you're trying to accomplish through the utility and use of an assessment, the easier it is to narrow in on a specific vendor or a specific assessment to help with your problem. And so what we've done here is we've given you a list of questions that as you narrow in on specific vendors, that you've researched and found seem to be a good fit for your problem. Questions that you can ask those vendors to help zero in on which ones are likely to be a good fit and which ones are likely to be reputable in solving your problem. And so it can be very helpful to understand, can this assessment and assessment vendor personalize your assessment, right? Can they brand it for you? Can they change the language in the welcome and the closing pages to communicate with your candidates the way that you want your candidates to be communicated with? Will they partner with your team to learn your organization and collaborate and ensure that the assessment that they're recommending and implementing is a good fit for your needs and your organization and your culture? Importantly, do they have assessment experts in-house that are regularly investigating and validating assessments and ensuring that the psychometric properties are solid and that the science is grounded, right? Do they have those IOs on staff that can serve as partners with you to ensure you're getting the most out of your assessment? Have they thought about candidate experience? Is their assessment platform 40 years old? Is it mobile compatible? Is it accessible for candidates with disabilities? Some of the technical bits, can they integrate with your ATS, right? We talked about process, how important process is, and where the assessment fits into that process is so critical for the long-term success of an assessment program. So do they integrate with ATSs? Is it going to feel like a seamless experience for your candidates? How do they consider data post-implementation in making updates and enhancements to the assessment? Can the assessment grow and evolve as your roles and your organization grows and evolves? Do they assist in evaluating the success of the tool? And then certainly scalability, right? Maybe your problem now is with your entry-level call center customer service reps. But in 2 years, if that problem becomes an issue with the supervisors of those reps, do they have the tools and the ability to scale with you and to solve additional problems that you might face in the future? And so highly recommend, you use these questions as you get into conversations with vendors to evaluate their potential fit for you.
Absolutely. So, I think we talked about this at the beginning in terms of how crowded the marketplace can be. And our goal, was to provide you guys not only with a framework, but certainly with some specific questions that you can ask so that it goes from this to marketing magic, which was a much less crowded space. I know it looks like no marketing magic, but that's okay. I know we appreciate you guys, kind of sharing with us or hanging with us while we talk through the process. We would be remiss if we didn't share just a tiny bit about us and kind of where we sit within the space that I think Craig just, did such a great job of articulating to you guys. We highlighted the personalized kind of in the middle, right, of that off the shelf and the fully custom, which is precisely where we live. Our approach is to do exactly what Craig talked about in terms of your challenge and to really partner with our clients so that we can understand what's going on in your business and then measure exactly what you need to measure. And there's a couple pieces that go into that, but the first is just a ton of collaboration in terms of the beginning of getting to know you guys, really understanding at a deep level your organization, the role that you're having challenges with or roles, and then starting to partner with you to really unpack those. This is Craig's team. This is what they do all day. So I'll let him share some highlights about what that looks like and how we approach that with our clients.
Yeah, thanks. I think ultimately the success of any assessment program, like we've talked about, hinges upon the assessment being a good fit for the organization and the problem that the organization is trying to solve, right? And so how do you ensure that it is a good fit? Well, it starts with partnership, right? So we have industrial organizational psychologists who are experts in psychometric assessment, who are experts in the science behind skills and personality and cognitive and situational judgment assessment. What we are not experts in is your organization and the problem that you're having and your culture and the history and the cost of that problem and your process. And so, our approach has always been that we want to partner with you to understand the challenges that your talent teams are facing in recruiting candidates, the challenges that your managers are having in helping those candidates achieve success, and then using that partnership to define and understand what we need to measure and why we need to measure it. So if your talent teams are telling us, hey, we're serving up great candidates, and your hiring managers are saying, our candidates are great, they come in, they knock it out of the park for 2 weeks, and then they disappear, right? Well, that challenge and that problem helps us inform what we need to measure. And so the more that we can do to partner and learn the problem that you're trying to solve, the better equipped we are to surface an assessment package that's uniquely built to solve that problem. And I think the assessment package bit is so important. And it's not really a piece that we've gotten to yet, which is oftentimes people tend to think of assessments as a thing. Like you have a test for Excel, or you have an assessment for personality, or you've got a structured interview that you offer up. But oftentimes assessments are components that best exist across the candidate to employee life cycle. And so the kinds of things that you want to assess very early on in the hiring process, right? Basic job alignment components around pay and schedule alignment and expectations. Those things are probably best gathered very early on in the screening phase. Whereas things like cognitive abilities or hard skills or personality components might be best assessed somewhere in the middle. So we've qualified that this person has the right kind of experience, that we're aligned on pay and schedule and all of those kind of basic factors. And now we want to really dig into who they are and if they're going to be a good fit for this role. Well, that type of assessment probably best exists in the center of your process before those final interviews, but after those initial screening conversations. And so a critical part of our partnership is often defining how do we best drop the assessment modules in at the most appropriate part of the process to get the data that we need when we need it. And Sarah, you can probably speak to, how those solutions have ultimately, been deployed and implemented within some of our client partners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a couple good examples that I think articulate what Craig is talking about. We have a fair amount of clients who have warehouse employees, right? And they're not only the unique insights that they need to gather throughout that process allow us to really kind of partner at multiple steps, but the challenges that they come with, when you're talking about warehouse roles, right? It's often that what we call like early tenure turnover. They're not making it through training, or they're not really making it past the first 30 days. And so when we uncover what's really driving that challenge, we've got some that are doing a job preview at the very beginning to highlight, hey, you're going to be walking through a freezer. It's really cold. And oh, by the way, you're walking through a freezer in the Michigan winter, right? So there's a lot of positives, there's a lot of benefits, but know that what you're getting into is not for everyone. And so we're giving them the chance to kind of opt out there, because the challenge that we heard was there's this big discrepancy between what these candidates expect when they apply for a warehouse job and then what they're actually walking into on day one when they step inside that freezer. So that was a spot where we're saying, okay, that needs to live at the beginning. And then as we get further down the path, let's start to look at their spatial awareness, right? They're pickers, they're in a warehouse. They need to be able to work through all of these instructions that they're receiving and then grab the right items and pack them effectively on the box. On the flip side of that, right, we've got a client that is actually looking to better hire, that's looking to better hire some of their customer service agents that we've talked about, kind of a ton on this call today. And so it's not really a job preview, right, that we're looking for. We kind of skip right into making sure that they have the right soft skills, to be able to navigate these phone calls that they're having, right? You have to be empathetic. You have to be a great listener. You have to be able to problem solve on the fly. So we're kind of pairing this soft skill and hard skill in the beginning. And then for those that are a good fit there, we actually move them to, at the end of the process, this basic computer literacy skill, right? Where they found the most drop off was people just could not navigate the software. So we give them the insights they need at the beginning. And then before they make an offer, they have full confidence that these individuals will make it through training because they can, in fact, navigate the software. So just a few examples of how we've kind of really started with the problem, right? To understand what are you looking to solve, and then inserted the right insights at multiple steps in the process so that it's a really, I'm going to say, a great candidate experience, right? But it keeps it short for the candidates. It keeps it relevant. You're not having everyone take a monolithic assessment when maybe at the very onset, within the first 5 minutes, we know they're not best suited. So we do have the opportunity to really partner and not only make your life a little bit easier working through all the hiring steps because you've got that knowledge at your fingertips that you need, but also making sure that the candidates still leave with a pretty good taste in their mouth after going through your process and not feeling like their time was wasted either. It's kind of a win-win there. All right. I know we're kind of at the end of our time. I think we had about 45 minutes today and we wanted to carve out some time for questions. But I do want to pause here and say we appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon and walking through not only kind of the space, but how we hope that you can better navigate it. And then just a tidbit about us and where we sit. So just calling out that we've got 2 ways that you can connect with us. Craig loves to talk about this one, and I'm going to steal his thunder for one moment because I feel like he's probably needing some water. But if you would love to connect with one of our IO psychologists and have a sales-free conversation just about your challenges, or kind of maybe you've tried to navigate the assessment space and you've got some questions, or you're just starting, definitely use that orange button. His team, again, I promise they're not salesmen. They are self-proclaimed assessment nerds that would love to chat with you about what's going on in your business and how assessments in general might be able to help. That purple link is going to be for anyone that's interested in hearing more about us specifically at High Match. If we sound like we might be a good fit for what you're looking for, or you just even want to hear more or see more, click that purple link and you'll get in touch with one of my sales team members, right? They are experts on our solution and really digging into your challenge so that they can start to put together some options for you that might help. I know I wanted to call out too that I think our more marketing magic happened while I was talking. I believe the links are in the chat as well. So if those buttons don't work, the links are in the chat, and then we'll definitely send the slide deck that we covered today in a follow-up email. I will also touch on, I know that Craig mentioned it, this was one part of our webinar series. There are multiple others here that we've done. So if you're interested in kind of going back on your own time and listening through one of them, please definitely take the time to listen to some of those webinars. I think most of these are actually a really nice follow-up to what we've talked about today in terms of, navigating some of the challenges that you might have identified as the first step of today. And I believe that's all we've got. So we'll open it up. If there's any questions, please feel free to use I believe there's like a Q&A section or the chat, whatever's easiest. We'd be happy to share. A question. This person is asking, what are the most common mistakes that organizations make when choosing an assessment?
I'll jump on that one from my perspective.
Yeah.
I think most often the biggest mistake that I see is they match the wrong assessment to their problem. They measure the wrong stuff, right? And so oftentimes, folks get, I think, enamored with bells and whistles, right? Or the latest, greatest test, like, ooh, we've made new advancements. There's a test that's going to solve all your problems. Like, ooh, we can measure an individual's entire personality in 90 seconds. and the reality is that it's the wrong approach to solve the problem that you're having, right? If you're not having a problem with candidate flow, but you are having a problem with candidate fit, then you don't really need a 90-second assessment, right? What you need is something that measures the right things and is heavily targeted on giving you the data that you need to solve the problem that you're having. And so I think oftentimes, organizations look for an assessment uh, disconnected from the actual problem that they're having. And so the assessment choice should always begin with the problem that you're trying to solve, and then look for an assessment that's built to solve that problem, not the inverse, because no assessment is built to solve every problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I concur. What other questions can we answer?
Oh, I saw one pop through. Question is, what key metrics should we be tracking to measure the effectiveness of our hiring process? And so some of the ones that we, often see, obviously turnover retention is a huge one, right? If you're getting people into the job and they're not sticking, then oftentimes, that there's something amiss with the candidate evaluation, or in some cases, we learn that it's not really the candidate evaluation, but it's something about the training or something about, early tenure management that is creating a disconnect and causing that turnover. So turnover and retention is often a big one. The other piece is that any strong assessment process should positively impact your already existing KPIs. And so if you've taken the time to define out KPIs for a given position, right? Customer satisfaction scores, number of calls booked for sales representatives, number of mistakes for a warehouse order filler or picker, a good assessment process should positively impact those existing KPIs, right? Because KPIs are by definition the key performance indicators in that position. And so if you're finding better candidates and you're hiring candidates who are better fit for the position, then you should see those already existing KPIs tick up. And that's why we always say, choosing an assessment always hinges upon defining a problem first. And oftentimes the first place that a problem starts to bubble up is either with turnover or dipping KPIs. And so those are often the two things that we're tracking, most directly and intently, especially early on post implementation of an assessment process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll agree and add, turnover, I think, and or retention, right? Like whichever way you're kind of looking at the kind of same side of or different side of the same coin. That one is certainly, I think, the biggest reason why people come to us, right? And why they start looking at assessments. But I will say, I love the question because it's a part of what you need to measure for sure. But unless early tenure turnover, right? And I'm talking about the first 90 days or sooner, unless that's your real turnover problem, that's definitely a longer term metric that you're looking to solve, right? So we know that by the time you've implemented an assessment, it's been adopted by the team, you've had enough throughput in terms of candidates and then hires, and then had the ability to look at those hires, effectiveness through training, how long it took them to reach productivity, did they make it to the 12-month mark, right? That can certainly be a more longer term goal. So we always love to put a stake in the ground as to where you're at today with employee retention or employee turnover. And we certainly want to look towards that every time that we connect, right? So ours is quarterly. We want to talk about it every time. But any of those additional KPIs that Craig talked about, we love to have those as supplemental, and anything else that we can do to help you be more efficient. So sometimes we'll look at time to hire, right? So like from application to offer, were we able to shorten that because you're better screening candidates, or because you're able to do one less interview because half that information is being collected in a 20-minute assessment instead of taking the time to schedule an interview and then sit together for an hour. So we'll look at efficiencies in that regard as well. But I think there's a ton of things we can look at. We always love to be looking at 4 or 5 things. But I think it's a good point, Craig, that, whether it's turnover or retention, and then the additional, KPIs that go with the role, those are what we often look at.
Absolutely.
Let me see. I want to check to see any other questions or anything we can answer. Perfect. I don't see any others coming through. Craig, if you'll go back to the previous screen, we'll leave this up for just a minute while we wrap up Just want to call out one more time. We would love the opportunity to connect with you one-on-one. We know often there are hundreds of people sitting on these, and not everyone gets to have their questions answered, or to, to walk away with maybe the one thing that they had wanted to ask. But please do grab some time. I promise that we will be so friendly and not push anything on you. We just love learning about different organizations, and maybe we can share how we've helped someone just like yourself, or maybe even just point you in the direction to another option that may be the best fit for you. So happy to do whatever suits you guys best. But I believe there are no more questions, so we will wrap it up. You'll be seeing this information come across via email, and that way you've got the slides and a way to reach out to us. But I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Happy Wednesday, and hopefully we will see you on the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Bye, everybody.